Hello everyone, welcome to a presentation of the Chapter 7 Government Policy and International Trade. So far, we have gone through the topics related to the political reality of international trade. We understood why do government intervene in markets. We have also understood the political arguments for government intervention. Now we will move to the economic arguments for government intervention. In the recent years, with the development of the new trade theory and strategic trade policy, the economic arguments for government intervention have undergone a renaissance. There are two arguments based upon that. The first one is the infant industry argument, which is by the far oldest economic argument for government intervention, and it was proposed by Alexander Hamilton in 1792. According to this argument, an industry should be protected until it can develop and be viable and competitive internationally. It is accepted as the justification for temporary trade restriction under the World Trade Organization. Now there arises a question: when is an industry grown up? At the same time, the critics argued that if a country has the potential to develop a viable competitive position, its firm should be capable of raising necessary funds without additional support from the government. Second one is the strategic trade policy. It is argued that by appropriate actions, a government can help raise national income if it can somehow ensure that the firm or firms that gain first mover advantages in an industry are domestic rather than foreign enterprises. The strategic trade policy arguments has two components. First is that the government can help firms from their countries attain these advantages. The second component is that the government can help firms overcome barriers to entry into industries where foreign firms have an initial advantage. Now we should understand when should government avoid using trade barriers. The strategic trade policy arguments of the new trade theory suggest an economic justification for trade intervention in international trade. In response to this challenge to economic orthodoxy, Paul Krugman argues that a strategic trade policy aimed at establishing domestic firms in a dominant position in a global industry are beggar thy neighbor policies that boost national income at the expense of other countries. For instance, countries that attempt to use such policy will probably provoke retaliation. Krugman also argues that since special interest groups can influence government, strategic trade policy is almost certain to be captured by such groups who will distort it into their own ends. Now we will have a look on how has the current world trading system emerged. By the 1930s, the British attempt to stimulate the free trade was buried under the economic rubble of the Great Depression. Economic problems were compounded in 1930 when the US Congress passed the Smoot-Hawley tariff. Aimed at avoiding rising unemployment by protecting domestic industries and diverting consumer demand away from foreign products, the Smoot-Hawley Act erected an enormous wall of tariff barriers. The Smoot-Hawley Act had a damaging effect on employment abroad. Other countries reacted by raising their own tariff barriers. US exports tumbled in response and the world slid further into Great Depression. After the World War II, the US and the other nations realized the value of free trade, established the General Agreement on the Tariff and Trade, which is a multilateral agreement to liberalize trade. Now we will have a look on how has the current world trading system emerged. By the 1930s, the British attempt to stimulate free trade was buried under the economic rubble of the Great Depression. Economic problems were compounded in 1930 when the US Congress passed the Smoot-Hawley tariff, aimed at avoiding rising unemployment by protecting domestic industries and diverting consumer demand away from foreign products. The Smoot-Hawley Act erected an enormous wall of tariff barriers. The Smoot-Hawley Act had a damaging effect on employment abroad. Other countries reacted by raising their own tariff barriers. US exports tumbled in response, and the world slid further into Great Depression. After the World War II, the US and other nations realized the value of free trade, also established the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which is a multilateral agreement to liberalize trade. During the 1980s and early 1990s, the trading system erected by the GATT came under strain as pressure for greater protectionism increased around the world. There were three reasons for the rise in such pressures during the 1980s. The first is the economic success of Japan during that time strained the world trading system. Japan's perceived protectionist policies created intense political pressures in other countries. The second reason is that the world trading system was strained by the persistent trade deficit in the world's largest economy, that is, the United States. The third reason for this trend was towards the greater protectionism was that many countries found ways to get around GATT regulations, that is, the use of non tariff barriers increased. In 1986, GATT members embarked on the eighth round of negotiations to reduce tariffs, the Uruguay round, which was the most ambitious round of negotiations yet. In the Uruguay round, member countries sought to extend GATT rules to cover trade in services. They also sought to write rules governing the protection of intellectual property, to reduce agricultural subsidies, and to strengthen the GATT monitoring and enforcement mechanism. It also focused on the World Trade Organization, as it was hoped that the enforcement mechanism would make the World Trade Organization a more effective policeman of the global trade rules. The World Trade Organization acts as an umbrella organization that encompasses the GATT along with two new sister organizations. The first one is the General Agreement on Trade in Services, that is GATS. The GATS has taken the lead in extending free trade agreement to services. The second sister organization is the Agreement on Trade Related Aspects of Intellectual Property Rights, that is TRIPS, which works to develop common international rules for intellectual property rights. The World Trade Organization has emerged as an effective advocate and facilitator of future trade deals, particularly in such areas as services. In 2013, World Trade Organization had 159 members. The World Trade Organization members collectively account for 98% of the world trade. So far, the World Trade Organization policy and enforcement mechanisms are having a positive effect, as most countries have adopted World Trade Organization recommendations for trade disputes. And it also acts as a magnet for various groups protesting free trade.
Hello everyone, my name is Chirag Annie, and today I'll be talking about what is the future of the World Trade Organization. The current focuses of the World Trade Organization are: number one, anti dumping policy. Dumping is a situation where the price of a product is cheaper in the importing country than it is in the exporting country. A prominent example of this term is Chinese steel. Excess production of steel in China led to the fall of price of steel products from China. These exports were mainly sent to the countries of the European Union. The excess steel meant that the same steel cost less in Europe than it did in China. This made it very hard for the European steel manufacturers to compete with the more to compete, and more Chinese steel was being sold that benefited the Chinese economy. World Trade Organization included anti-dumping policies in the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trades, known as the GATT. Article 4 of GATT allowed the World Trade Organization to determine if dumping of a product was taking place and implement anti-dumping tariffs if dumping was established. United Kingdom and the European Union were allowed to impose an anti-dumping tax on Chinese manufactured steel by the World Trade Organization. Number two, the income of the agriculture sector has been steadily declining for years in most developed and developing nations. This contributes to increased inequality and poverty in the backbone of the food industry. The World Trade Organization on included an agreement of agriculture in the GATT that focuses on the reduction of tariffs of agricultural goods that allows for fair competition and decrease in subsidies provided by the government to the agricultural sector. Point 3. GATT also included the agreement on trade related aspects of intellectual property rights, known as TRIPS, that sets the minimum standards for rules and regulations related to intellectual property. These include copyrights, trademarks, trade names, and patents. These steps were taken to protect creators from potential fraud and contribute to the economic welfare in a world of rapid technological advancements. Point 4. Non-agricultural in market access, known as NAMA agreement, was also implemented in the GATT. NAMA includes all products not included in the Agreement of Agriculture. It includes all manufactured products and accounts for 90% of exports. The aim of NAMA was to decrease the tariffs imposed on these items to make them cheaper and more accessible for the developing and underdeveloped nations of the world. After the Uruguay Roundtable from 1986 to 1994, Doha Development Agenda was held from 2001 to 2013. The agenda of these World Trade Organization meetings focused mainly at the priorities of the less developed countries and to help them catch up to the developing and developed nations of the world. This materialized in the form of Bali Trade Agreement in 2013 that focused on reducing global trade barriers and contributing to a more global economy. However, there have been many clashes between the developing and developed nations in these talks, as well as the United States and the European Union, and therefore not a lot has been achieved in the Doha Development Agenda. Due to there being so many disagreements between the members of the World Trade Organization, the Doha Development Agenda was called off after 2013. Managers of firms decide resource allocation and recognize potential markets to trade in. Hence, it is very important for them to be aware of potential implications of trade barrier and government policies. If a country increases the trade barriers and taxes imposed on importing products, the items sold may not be profitable and makes it harder to trade that product with another country. An example of this is voluntary export restraints, known as VER, that restricts the amount of a specific product that can be exported to the country. In the 1980s, the automobile industry of the United States was declining due to more cost and fuel efficient Japanese cars that were being exported to the American market. In 1980, the government of the United States capped Japanese car imports at 1.68 million cars for that year. The quota of the quota was increased to 1.85 million cars in 1984 and 2.3 million cars in 1985. The VER was eventually removed in 1994. Japanese manufacturers purchase assembly plants in the southern states of the United States to form mergers with American manufacturers to work around the voluntary export restraints. Many of the adjustments made by managers to strategies is due to constant changes in markets, be that due to altered demand or trade barriers imposed by a government. To conform to these requirements, a firm may have to locate more production activities in a given market than it would otherwise. Due to these reasons, managers of firms are more inclined to support free trade policies as it would require them to alter their expensive sales strategies less often. Thank you.